Hello everybody, it's Silver. This is South of Midnight. So this is an action-adventure. As useful as that term is, it actually describes this game pretty well. And it's got this kind of old-school vibe to it, but really the game is pretty interesting because it's taking place in the South, and we don't usually see like Deep South mythology in video games. So in terms of the overall atmosphere and how everything comes together, you're looking at something like a kind of Cajun culture or like a little bit of that Gothic South culture. So the first thing to talk about would be its presentation in terms of how all this actually works and comes together. And the way the game looks is pretty interesting. It's got this very stylized, almost cartoonish art style that reminds me of like the Psychonauts era of action-adventure games, that sort of PS2 era, but brought forward into the future with, modern techniques. So it looks really, really good, and I think the standout in terms of how the game looks would be its environment design. It's got very cool looking environments. There's some really inventive, unique stuff here, and even the not more fantastical stuff, it still looks really, really good, like those sort of rolling green bucolic hills that you see in southern farmland and stuff. It all just looks really nice. Animations are another standout because they're deliberately very exaggerated, and again, this is another thing that reminds me of like the Psychonauts era of games like this, because they also had that cartoonishly exaggerated animation where everything was like 120%, everything sort of flew around the screen in a really obvious way, and this game kind of looks a lot like that, although there is an interesting extra bit here, and that it seems like a lot of the game's assets and things, they look like they're animated in stop motion. I don't know if this is exactly what they're going for deliberately, or if this is just how it ends up looking, but you'll notice that a lot of things that move, a lot of stuff in the environment that sways around or moves in some way, it looks like it's been animated via like a stop motion technique. And the really exaggerated animations also continue into the combat, where you have these very flashy combos that you can do, and the enemies also have these really heavily exaggerated movements, which on one hand can make it really easy to see when they're about to attack you, but on the other hand, sometimes their movements are so exaggerated that it's easy to misinterpret them simply moving around as an attack. But still, I do think that overall, this heavily exaggerated method of animating things it goes in the game's favor. And the other really good part about its presentation would be its music, because this game's music is really, really cool. It's got some kind of unique details about how its music works. Like, for instance, whenever you are using your magic, your sort of thread weaving capabilities, there will be this sort of whispery voice-like sound that creeps in, which means every time you double jump or every time you wall run or anything like that, you get these little bits of like a whispery sound in the background, which is a neat effect. But also, the music itself is very dynamic. It changes quite a bit depending on what's going on. And you'll notice that when it comes to the big flashy set pieces, the big boss fights and stuff, there's actually unique music for those areas, by which I mean it's composed with lyrics that are related to what's going on. This is unusual. You don't often see boss fight music with lyrics unless it's like Latin chanting or something, but in this case it's a lot more understandable traditional lyrics, and they're related to the boss's story or what has happened before you got here and stuff like that, and it creates this kind of unique atmosphere that goes heavily into that sort of Cajun southern area. And it all means that the overall soundscape of the game sounds really cool. I definitely like how the music, the more exploration-y and like non-combat music, is more chilled out and often has like whispers of lyrics, but not easily understandable like solid lyrics. They're more like ghostly wisps of what could be a voice, but you're not sure. And then once the action starts in, then more understandable, clear and loud lyrics start in. So overall, I think the game's presentation is one of its best points. It is very cool looking and it's very cool sounding, and both the audio and visual aspects do a really good job of immersing you in this interesting southern ambience. In terms of how the game plays, it's mixed between a couple of different things. You've got platforming and you've got combat. You've also got exploration in the middle of the platforming. And that's, the very standard old school style action adventure formula. Again, like that Psychonauts era of action adventure games, this has that same kind of structure. That late PlayStation 2 era of feeling is kind of what the game feels like to me, and I think it's neat that it actually evokes that pretty successfully. But how it plays is mostly you're going to be exploring linear levels that are relatively open in terms of your exploration possibilities, because there's quite a bit of stuff off of the side that you can find, like a good number of notes and like little logs that you can find that will give you some more context of the characters in that area, as well as just the past of that area in general and what kind of happened here before you came along. But you'll also find other collectibles that are useful, like these things called floofs, which is what you use to upgrade yourself. And you'll also find these very rare but occasional health shard thingies that will, once you collect 3 of them, upgrade the size of your health gauge. But even though there is some openness, for the most part, these areas are linear, highly linear, in fact. This whole game is kind of like a theme park. It is, it's mostly in a straight line with some side stuff here and there, and this means that the game is actually paced really well, in my opinion, because it does have its issues, but its issues don't really have a chance to become a big problem, because by the time they would become a problem, the game's over. For instance, how the combat works is overly simplistic, I think, for the amount of combat that you do, but again, it doesn't really have all that much time to overstay its welcome because the game is so short. You've got a basic combo that you can do, as well as a charged attack, a heavy charge attack that you can unlock later on in the game, and then you can also do things like use your spells, which is kind of cool because they're usable in exploration and in combat. They have 2 uses each, which is neat. You can like weave enemies with a spell that will stun them for a while and make them take amplified damage, or you can pull them towards you like a grappling hook or push them away from you, which you can also use on enemy projectiles and things to deflect them. So there is some nuance to the combat system, but it is relatively basic. Whenever you defeat an enemy, they will become unravelable. They'll sort of get stunned on the ground, and you can unravel them with a quick button press. You don't have to do this. They don't come back or anything if you don't do it. They will vanish eventually. But it's useful to unravel them as often as you can because it restores a bit of your health, as well as restoring a bit of your cooldowns for your spells. I think where the combat falls short the most, aside from the fact that you only have one basic combo you can do, is in the enemy variety. There aren't that many different kinds of enemies that you'll face throughout the game. The game does do a fair job of spacing them out so that you will, find new ones even towards the end of the game, but even then, there's still not very many. And also you could say that the strategy for each of the enemy types is basically exactly the same. Just wail on them with your basic combo until they die for the most part. Occasionally they'll turn yellow, which means get out of the way because they're invincible and they're going to do an unblockable attack, so just dodge out of the way of that, and then dodge back in and start attacking them again until you can unravel them. It is a simplistic combat system, but it does sort of do its job as a bit of extra gameplay in between the exploration bits. Now, as you would probably expect, where the combat system really comes alive is in the boss fights. The boss fights are your more sort of scripted puzzle boss fights where you have a specific order of events that you've got to figure out to do in order to beat the boss. So you'll have to do something involving the environment to make the boss show their weak point and wail on their weak point for a while, and then they'll go back and repeat. Each boss also has a segmented health gauge that separates their boss fight into phases. So usually each boss has 2 to 3 phases depending on the size of their health gauge. And this means that they are definitely the highlight of the combat system. They are not difficult. In fact, I would say overall this game is very, very easy. I basically never failed a single combat or a single boss fight throughout my whole time playing it, even though I kind of played badly a couple times because I was figuring out dodge timings and stuff. It's really so uncomplicated that it's very simple and very easy. So even though the boss fights are the highlight of the combat, they're not going to call upon you to do anything too difficult or complicated. There's also a bit of a structure to how the game works in terms of its sort of boss fights and stuff and how you lead up to them, because the way that it actually works is you'll enter an area, you'll explore it a bit, and then you'll discover these big, twisted, gnarled knots of anger and misery and stuff like that, and the whole idea is you're unraveling these to fix the overall atmosphere of the area being so drenched in sorrow. So for each of these big combats that you complete, you will unravel a big knot, and then it will give you some story context on the boss of that area and how they became what they are in the current day. So you'll get their backstory and understand what they are. You'll then get their backstory in like 3 to 4 segments until you understand completely who they are and why. And then after that, you'll have a chase sequence. So after you fill up this bottle with all of these disparate combat elements, you'll have a chase sequence where you got to make it back to the bottle tree, where you go to sort of dispel all of this stuff and get the big symbol that you will cast on the boss to make them vulnerable and actually fightable. And the chase sequences are where the game has its most complicated platforming. There's very simple platforming throughout most of the game. It's all very easy stuff, just mostly climbing ledges and jumping, double jumping gaps and stuff. It's not a complicated setup in terms of how all of the platforming works. It's definitely simplistic in terms of the platforming. But during these chase sequences, that's where you get the more advanced platforming stuff. It's still just like the boss fights. It's not going to call upon you to do anything too difficult, but it is more complex than everywhere else. And you are, of course, timed during the chase sequence because this evil fog is chasing you, and you've got to run through these areas to make it back to the bottle tree. And during the chase sequence is when you're going to use all of the movement tech that you have used to explore throughout that area. It's going to all come together into one sort of final exam that you need to get through. And then once you make it back to the bottle tree, you'll get the weave that you need for that particular boss battle. You'll then find the boss wherever they are perched in that area and then fight them, and that'll be the end of that chapter, the end of that area, and you move on to the next area and do it all over again. Although there are sometimes transitional chapters that are much shorter than the big open boss fighting chapters that don't have boss fights at the end, that are more about traversing areas to get to the next big zone. So overall, it's a game with a pretty solid structure that feels like an old school action adventure sort of puzzle platformer structure that you would see on the PlayStation 2, just brought forward in time. And I actually quite like that. I think that's pretty neat. And I think overall this game's shortcomings when it comes to difficulty and variety don't have enough time to hurt it too much, because right when you're kind of getting tired of the enemy variety and right when everything is reaching the point where you're starting to suffer from lack of variety and stuff, the game's over, because this game is only going to last you about 8 or 9 hours or so. My personal playthrough clocked in at about 8.5-ish hours, so that's right on the money, it seems like. So even though I think the game has its problems when it comes to not enough variety and not enough challenge, I also think that the game's really nice ambience and atmosphere, its really cool presentation and music and exploration of the Southern Gothic style really helps to blunt those problems and make them not as much of an issue due to the short runtime and the nice immersion that the game actually gives you as you go through the areas. So if you're in the mood for something shorter, something that is not like super crazy advanced and difficult, as a shorter, more self-contained experience, then I don't have a problem recommending South of Midnight. I think it does a good job, and it reminds me of some old school games that I really enjoyed back in the day. The game is also on Game Pass, which is a very good place to play it. In my opinion, this is like the perfect length for a Game Pass game because it allows you to install it, get through it pretty quickly, and then move on to something else. And it is memorable enough to, I think, be worth doing that because of its really cool presentation and art and music and stuff. So I'll put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page for South of Midnight if you wish to check it out yourselves. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.